Hi everyone, welcome back to PCS 101. This happens to be for our class for Wednesday, the 11th, though I am recording this on Tuesday night, the 10th. As you know, that 11:59 p.m. on Tuesday night is when your first speech, the autobiographical speech, should be posted onto our Moodle site. So I look forward to listening to those speeches, and you should be sending me your outline, and that's via PDF to my email, ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu, which means that we are moving forward and talking a little bit about speech number 2. And that is an informative speech where now that you've had the opportunity to practice some of the speech techniques that we've been discussing, we can utilize them and expand and develop by talking about a subject that we know perhaps a little less well than we might know our own biography. What I usually recommend for the informative speech is that you choose a topic of something that you already have some knowledge of to help save time, particularly in a condensed class such as this one. So you might want to think about a hobby or an interest that you have, perhaps something that you've written about in another class that you could adapt for speech, perhaps something that you have learned about or you are learning about in another class. It could also be something that you referenced in your autobiographical speech that you could teach us about. So, in terms of this autobiographical speech, you have twice as much time, or in terms of this informative speech, I'm sorry, you have twice as much time as you had during the autobiographical speech. So now you have 10 minutes to teach us something. And there are lots of different ways that you could go about doing this. You can do it with your traditional kind of lecture, but you can also do it with a demonstration where you are showing rather than telling, or some combination of the two. And of course, you'll want to make sure that you're adapting it so that it is appropriate for the filming that we are doing for this particular course. Now, I'm asking you to use one audio or visual for this speech. I don't know if any of you used an audio or visual in your autobiographical speech. I'll find out soon enough. But I didn't want you to have to worry about incorporating that into an informative speech, which is what or to worry about incorporating that into an autobiographical speech, your first speech, which is why we are instead waiting until the informative speech to talk about how to do that. So what I wanted to talk about were different kinds of visual and audio media that you could use, as well as informative speeches as a whole, and also talk about supporting materials. And while you aren't going to be required to use supporting materials until your third and final speech, that happens to be the persuasive speech, where I'm going to ask you to use 3 outside resources, you might find it to be helpful to use outside sources in your informational speech. It just depends on how comfortable you are with the topic which you are discussing with your audience. So I thought that I could address that as well. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about deadlines because we know that ultimately the intersession is very condensed. And it turns out that we are headed towards a 3-day weekend because Monday, the 16th, happens to be Martin Luther King Day. And that means that we aren't meeting in class. I sort of anticipated that when I had scheduled speech number 2, which would be due this upcoming Friday at 11:59 p.m., thinking that you could use that holiday weekend in part to prepare for next week, which is when we would do our third and final speech, and that happens to be the persuasive speech. We've got just a little bit of wiggle room here, and that if you were looking at the course outline, you can see that our very last class is scheduled as catch-up. In the event that there was inclement weather or something to the effect that would somehow put us behind schedule, the good news is that we're in an online class. That said, technically online classes are not supposed to meet when the college is closed. And I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but the college has had 2 late openings so far, which meant that technically 2 of our classes should not have occurred. But I made an executive judgment to continue class anyway, knowing that you could always contact me for an extension if necessary. And again, because we just aren't certain of what Mother Nature is going to be doling out, I thought it was better to be a little bit more conservative. So what I'm saying is that ideally you would have speech number 2, your informative speech, posted on our Moodle site by Friday, the 13th, it so happens to be, by 11:59 p.m. But if it turns out that you needed a little bit of an extension, we do have that long weekend coming up. So that if it turns out that you needed a little bit more time and that would be helpful to you, please reach out to me and we could arrange something. But do understand that what that means is that ultimately you would have less time to prepare for your third and final speech, the persuasive speech, which I have scheduled for Thursday the 19th. Friday the 20th is when we have our final quiz. And then, of course, on the 23rd, Monday, the last day of class, this is our catch-up class in the event that we were to need it. But moving forward and talking a little bit about informative speeches, that basically your job is to teach us about something. And if you're using the edition of the text that I had ordered for class, on page 196, you should find a list of possibilities. You can talk about people, you can talk about places, things, ideas, procedures. And that said, oftentimes individuals will choose things that, again, they have some prior knowledge of, or at the very least some interest in learning a little bit more about. I've heard many informative speeches over the course of my career. Some of them have been quite interesting, actually, whether it be talking about the origins of holidays that we celebrate, whether it be talking about the history of our geographic area, whether it be talking about some idea that you learned about in another class. And I remember one speech that was quite interesting. This worked because it was an in-person class where we were taught how to change the oil in our cars. And in fact, this speech was delivered in the parking lot of GCC where this speaker demonstrated how to change the oil. And they did so in 10 minutes with a backup plan in the event that there was inclement weather and they couldn't appear in the parking lot. One speech I probably will never forget that I had told you about was about the Heimlich maneuver, where ultimately they had staged a choking to engage audience interest, to shock us in effect. And then afterwards, the speaker obviously had some rapt attention from the audience to talk about how to perform the Heimlich maneuver. I call these kinds of speeches public service speeches because not only are they satisfying the requirements for public speaking, but they also are providing a service. I do remember hearing a speech about skin cancer where a member of the audience had indicated that they seemed to have several of the symptoms that were discussed in the speech. And the speaker said that obviously they weren't a medical professional, but that the audience member should go to a doctor, which they did and everything was fine. But imagine if it wasn't. That speech could have literally saved somebody's life. So I remember one speech that I heard was from a actually former used car salesman who was talking about the techniques to utilize when negotiating for a used car. I can tell you everyone was in rapt attention with that one because we've all probably had situations where we've had to negotiate with the dealer. And in fact, at the ending of the speech, there were still questions, and this student very nicely continued to take those questions during the break, not because they were being evaluated, but because they just wanted to be a good classmate and a good peer. Questions are also somewhat challenging when you are working in a situation where you are recording. Certainly, you can invite your audience members to ask questions in the comments section, but the reality is the more likely it is that you can address questions beforehand, the more likely it is that you can engage your audience. So do think about what some common questions might be in terms of your informative speech and try to address them. Some suggestions. You've got only 10 minutes. It might sound like a lot of time, but do limit your points. Keep in mind what we've said about memory and about listening skills. Both are quite poor for most people. Use transitions, ways to connect ideas. Avoid jargon or specialized language that's known for just a particular discipline. Cluster those like ideas when we were talking about memory techniques, which is something you probably do when you're trying to memorize things. Teachers will oftentimes present information in that way, just like they will oftentimes associate old concepts with new concepts. Use repetition, because again, repetition is more likely to be remembered by your audience. Address different learning styles, and this is one of the reasons why I'm asking you to use an audio or visual. We all learn in different ways. I would suspect that most people who are in college have strong skills in auditory learning, or they wouldn't have made it to college. They learn through listening, but you can also learn through seeing. It's one of the reasons why professors, for instance, will use whiteboards or include notes, much like I do at the bottom of this video. Sometimes they learn through doing. So that said, the more learning styles that you can accommodate when you are presenting your information, the more likely it is that your audience will learn the information. And sometimes you have to motivate your audience. Sometimes your audience isn't particularly interested in learning information. I think about a Shakespeare class that I teach. Actually, I'll be teaching in the spring semester. And motivating is something that I'm quite aware oftentimes needs to occur, that individuals aren't necessarily taking the class because they're Shakespeare aficionados, but because they're trying to satisfy a requirement, and which is fine. But I do spend a semester trying to convince, we'll see whether I'm effective or not by the ending of the semester, individuals that regardless of their course of study, chances are that it is of some relevance to them in one way or another. I think about other classes. I think I might have indicated that I teach a horror film class, which I am also teaching next semester under the heading of Media and Popular Culture, Communications course. And I usually find that the students who register in the class already have some motivation for it, or they wouldn't have registered for it. That's not to say that's universally true, but sometimes you have to motivate more than other times. And I do think about that speech I witnessed about the Heimlich maneuver, a speech that perhaps might be difficult to get audience interest for. But once we as audience members thought that we would actually need to perform a Heimlich maneuver, we were much more invested in the topic. So I think it was quite clever how this speaker decided to simulate a choking to get us invested in the topic. Now, visual media, you can go low tech, high tech, someplace in between. I'm not a snob. I think low tech can work just as well as high tech. Keep in mind, though, that your audio or your visual is supposed to supplement, not substitute for your speaking. That what we want to see is you. PowerPoint, for instance, is oftentimes many people's go-to, and I don't know if you've ever seen PowerPoint gone bad, as I put it, and there are many ways PowerPoint can go bad, whether it be through technological failure or technological inability. Somebody doesn't really know how to manipulate PowerPoint well, so it could be that they don't sync their slides with the content. It could be that they put too much content on their visuals. Again, it's supposed to be just keywords and phrases. It's not supposed to be something that an audience can consume. Or sometimes PowerPoint presenters will become what I call PowerPoint happy, and they show you literally everything that PowerPoint is capable of doing. And you don't want to overwhelm your audience with too many fonts and too many colors and too many sizes. Again, if you were giving a speech about what PowerPoint can do, then yes, that perhaps might make sense. But again, it's supposed to supplement, not substitute for. And again, since we are not presenting live, you'll want to think about what would be the best way of giving some audio or visual information like PowerPoint. So I do remember listening to a speech where the speaker had most of the screen devoted to their PowerPoint slides, and then they were just a little tiny box in the corner. It should have been the other way around. They should have been the large screen, and the PowerPoint should have been a box in the corner. That said, you don't have to use PowerPoint. You can use things like posters and whiteboards and pictures. Think about things like scale, for instance. So you want it to be visible, particularly with the camera. Think about the fact that if you've got text, it could appear backwards if you are filming. You can use prompts. Again, how are you best going to show those to your audience? You can use video and audio clips. Think about balance and timing, because ultimately what you want is that the bulk of the speech is devoted to you, not necessarily to a video or audio clip. So I would say no more than, let's say, 3 minutes in a 10-minute speech devoted to a video or an audio clip. Now, if you were giving an hour speech, perhaps you could have a 10-minute video or audio clip. But again, the whole point is that the focus is on you. If you think about pre-PowerPoint, we had something called flip charts. I don't know if you ever saw them or not, but basically they worked on the same principle. They were large pads of paper that were on an easel, and in effect what you would do is reveal each piece of paper on the pad when you wanted to show that piece of information. And again, sometimes old school ways work best. But do know that at this point in our society, we expect a certain level of professionalism. So you don't want to just scribble something on a piece of paper. You want it to look professional. You might want to record yourself on Zoom and do some screen sharing and then upload that video. If you're familiar with Zoom, that's one of the options that you've got when you're presenting on Zoom. So there are lots of different ways that you could go about this. Do be professional. Do test your equipment beforehand. Do have a backup plan in the event that there's technological failure. I'll never forget a speech. Well, actually, what it was a professional development seminar. This was in the early days of the internet, and it was devoted to faculty. And it was on a Saturday. It's not so easy to get a whole bunch of people available on a Saturday, which is what they did. And about 10 minutes into the professional development opportunity, GCC, and it turns out most of Greenfield had lost their electricity. This was during a summer class, I must say, or a summer month, so that we had natural light so we could continue on. But it's a bit difficult giving a presentation about technology when you can't use the technology. And I felt for those people. I really did, because they had prepared several hours worth of content that obviously they were going to have to adapt on the fly. Not ideal in any way. They did a remarkable job considering the sorts of challenges that they had. Of course, it's somewhat different when you are recording, because if you were to have a technological failure, you could re-record. But remember, there is no such thing as the perfect speech. I believe it was in this very class where I was recording and the telephone rang. I had already recorded a good amount of content, and I decided that I would just continue rather than stopping and re-recording all of that content. Again, probably something that would be much easier to do and that you would want to do in a 5-minute speech, but certainly not in a 40-minute class. So, and as I had indicated, this is not a class in editing, so you don't want to just edit together different pieces of video. What you want is what could you produce in one take, which is what you would be doing if you were doing live. Charts are very good for numbers, so people can visualize and conceptualize. Pictures are very good for emotions, and we tend to be made up of both, that we are made up of intellect, but we're also made up of emotion. You want to be clear, you want to be simple, you want to be neat. You want to, again, consider scale, balance, and proportion. Use color for interest, but don't overwhelm us with color so that it becomes distracting. Avoid writing text in all capitals. Just save that for important words or phrases. I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to read something written in all capitals. I suspect every English teacher has. And it is no easy task. So again, save the all capitals for just an important word or phrase. Interestingly, what studies have found that the way to get an audience to pay attention to something that's important is to bold that language rather than to underline it, that they're more likely to notice it if it's bolded. So, Supporting material that you could use in the event that you decided to use supporting material for this speech, but you certainly will with the third speech. Now, my suspicion is that you've probably discussed supporting materials in your English 101 class, and you've talked a little bit about citing and documenting. So you're well aware that different disciplines have different systems for citing or documenting. So the sciences, for instance, they use a system called APA, American Psychological Association. The humanities, that includes language and communications, use the MLA, or the Modern Language Association System, which is based on parenthetical documentation. That basically, within the context of your writing, at the ending of a quote, you put the page number or some identifying information of where to find that quote in parentheses following the quote. The good news is that things are much simpler when you're speaking than when you're writing. Obviously, when you're writing, you want to keep to a level of precision with your documentation. And it goes even further in that after that, at the ending of your writing, you've got something called a works cited page, where you're literally listing all of the works that you've cited or you've quoted from. And there are different techniques for citing, let's say, a book as opposed to a website, as opposed to a newspaper article. And you just have to follow the criteria. And I kind of liken it to a cookbook. You just follow all of the steps in the MLA handbook. And again, this is something you would do in your writing that you don't necessarily have to do in your speaking. We wouldn't want to be inundated with this level of depth or detail. What you want to do is to make sure that your audience is clear when you're sharing information that is not yours, that it belongs to someone else. And sometimes you can just do that with a simple tag, saying something to the effect of, according to experts. So anything that would follow that, the assumption would be that this is not your original research. That said, in the question and answer period of your speech, you should be able to supply additional information if necessary. And you should have that information written down someplace. You could have it in your head, but the likelihood of you remembering all of that, again, considering how poor our memories are, the likelihood is small. So I recommend that you've got notations for in your own notes, perhaps your speaking outline, which is what I'm going to ask with your third speech, that at the ending of your speaking outline, you list your sources so that I can look at them. And the reality is that I don't think your audience is going to be too particular about how you present that information, whether you use the MLA style or the APA style, but they are going to want the basic pieces of information that you would share with, let's say, a librarian or a bookstore owner so that you could find that original source. And the whole idea behind doing that is just so that somebody can verify that you were accurate with that quotation, that you were, it wasn't fiction or it wasn't a misrepresentation or anything of that nature. So again, I suspect that most of you probably won't be using outside sources until the third speech, but this will be useful eventually. But outside sources increase your credibility and your persuasiveness. It's one of the reasons why I'm requesting that you use them for the persuasive speech. And while I've divided these three speeches up into three categories, the reality is that you would probably be utilizing all of these techniques in a much longer speech. So think about a 50-minute speech where probably you would share some autobiographical elements and some informative elements, and there would probably be an element of persuasion in there. And you would probably use some outside resources and some audio visuals. But again, usually when you're asked to speak, you're not necessarily given a list of how you should put together your speech. That's up to you. And what you want to do is determine which resources would be best for your audience. You want to be audience-centered. If you remember that was on one of the quizzes. You definitely want to check for accuracy of your resources. And I know that when I talk about outside resources, people almost immediately think of Google or they immediately think of Wikipedia. Not that I'm averse to either one of them. They're quick, down, and dirty. But as you know, what makes them wonderful also makes them dangerous. That anybody can post anything. And we aren't necessarily sure if it's validity. So this is my pitch for using what you have access to as a GCC student. The GCC library, specifically the GCC databases, which look like you're on the open web, but you're not. that these databases are subscription based. So GCC basically pays the subscription with your tuition dollars. And the reason why they're subscription based is because they hire staff to review the information before that information is posted on their databases. That's not to say that an error still couldn't occur. You should always verify everything. But the information has been vetted to a point where there's a certain level of accuracy associated with it. And you can see in the notes below in the 6th section, I have given you the website for the GCC library. Though, honestly, any page you're on the GCC website, there is a link or there's an area to redirect you to the library, because we want the library to be easily found since you would use that as a student. And you can see that those library resources or those databases include quite a bit of information. You can do all kinds of searches. And that said, you can also search for video as well as for online materials. There also are periodicals, including things like the New York Times and the Greenfield Recorder, that you can search through as well. So again, your tuition dollars at work. You do need a code in order to be able to get in. That should be on your ID card or your GCC library card. If it turns out if you don't have that code and you are off campus, which I suspect you probably would be, then what you would need to do is to get your access code through the GCC library, which is easy enough to do. It takes 2 or 3 minutes. And basically, if you're looking at the library site, you can see that they've given you lots of different ways that you can contact them, whether it be through email or through text or through social media, or whether it be ultimately in person if you decided that you wanted to go to the library itself. So I encourage you to get access to that and to utilize that. Think about outside resources, not just necessarily in terms of the traditional ones. You can use interviews. That said, that you would want to have someone that you're interviewing that has a certain level of expertise so that ultimately they add value to your speech. And of course, you want to be as ethical as possible. So you want to show ethos, make sure they understand that they're being interviewed and you've given permission to share their identifying information and the content. If they don't want their name shared, then you want to give a pseudonym, something of that nature. And thinking about the kinds of information that you share, oftentimes outside resources are qualitative, they're anecdotes, but oftentimes they can also be quantitative. And this is facts and data. And I suspect that both of them are equally valid, just in different ways. So certainly knowing people's stories is very important. It's one of the reasons why individuals oftentimes will ask for feedback. But the quantitative data, the numbers, so to speak, not just what was your experience like at GCC, but how many people actually graduated, can be useful. Though, of course, that can also be misleading because oftentimes we have students who don't necessarily have the intent to graduate. They're planning to study at GCC and then move on to something else. The degree is not necessarily their end goal. So you have to be careful with that sort of thing. And primary accounts, whether that is a first-hand account, an eyewitness account, or a secondary account, which is usually based on the primary. It's usually scholarship. So the primary account, the eyewitness, takes somebody who's actually fought, let's say, in the Iraqi war. But the secondary account would be based on the scholarship that was done about the Iraqi war. Now, obviously, the person who has experience with being in the war themselves, they have a unique expertise about the war itself. But keep in mind that they could be mistaken and they could also be misleading. And also, they have seen a piece, but not necessarily the whole, which is where we go to the secondary sources, things like scholarships, people who spent their time basically researching the Iraqi war and using lots of different primary accounts in order to put together their evidence. Again, we'll talk a little bit about this more when we get to the third speech. So where this leaves us is with our attendance question and noting what it is that we're going to be doing next class. So next class, which happens to be Thursday, we are going to be watching some sample informative speeches that I will be posting for you, very similar to what we did with the or sample informative speeches, very similar to what we did with the sample autobiographical speeches. And I'm also going to be posting quiz 2, very similar to what you did with quiz 1. I just ask that you send me back quiz 2 via PDF to my email, ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And even though it might feel like you've just touched base with me with your first speech, it's time to do so again with your second speech. So you want to contact me before the 13th, which is Friday, about speech number 2. Whether you want to have a meeting with me on Zoom, whether you want to have a conversation with me on the phone, whether or not you want to have a chat dialogue with me in live time, or if email suffices, any of those. But do reach out to me about what's going on with your second speech. Certainly you can talk to me about the third speech as well, but you definitely want to focus on that second speech. So today's attendance question, and that's due on Thursday the 12th at 9 a.m. It's going to be a little bit different because I'm asking that you send the answer to my email rather than on our discussion forum. Because what I would like you to do is to watch all of the speech number 1s that were posted by your classmates in the top of the Moodle section and identify one strength and one weakness for each of those speeches. And please send that again privately to me, to my email, ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu by Thursday the 12th at 9 a.m. If you need additional time, please let me know. What I will do is I will compile all of that, and then I will present it to you as a class so that you can see your classmates' responses. But I did want to vet it first. So basically, that will do it for today's class. Next class, I'll post quiz number 2 as well as some sample informative speeches. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.